General Motors temporarily shutting down more than half of its plants in North America.
For decades, General Motors sold more than vehicles. It sold trust. Millions of drivers believed GM trucks and SUVs were built to last, engineered for durability, and backed by one of the most powerful manufacturing legacies in American history. But today, that trust is under siege. An ex-employee has stepped forward with claims that are now rattling the auto industry from the inside out. Not allegations of a simple defect, not a missed quality check, but accusations that GM knowingly approved an engine design destined to fail, and then quietly built an entire system around delaying, denying, and deflecting responsibility once those failures began. What makes this story explosive isn't just what allegedly went wrong under the hood. It's how long the problem may have been known, how deeply it may have been buried, and how many people could be affected as the fallout spreads. Owners are now questioning whether their vehicles were engineered to survive or engineered to fail on schedule. Mechanics are re-examining breakdowns they once dismissed as bad luck. Regulators are circling, and competitors are watching closely, waiting for the ground to shift. Why did these allegations surface now? Why did an insider choose this moment to speak? And if these claims are accurate, what does this mean not just for GM, but for every driver who trusted one of America's most iconic brands? Because this story didn't begin with engines dying on the highway. It didn't begin with lawsuits or recalls or settlements. According to the whistleblower, it began years earlier, inside GM's own engineering labs, with decisions that prioritized cost and speed over long-term survival. And once those decisions left the lab and hit the road, the consequences became impossible to hide. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. According to the whistleblower, the scandal at the heart of General Motors' V8 crisis didn't start with a recall or a customer complaint. It started with internal warnings that were ignored, and in some cases, allegedly overridden. The former employee who worked within GM's powertrain division claims that engineers identified severe durability risks during development of the new V8 platform. These weren't edge case failures under extreme abuse. They were breakdowns expected to occur under normal driving conditions. Internal testing reportedly revealed lifter components that wore down far faster than acceptable thresholds, cam lobes that degraded prematurely, and oil flow systems that struggled to maintain consistent pressure once engines were exposed to real-world heat cycles. According to the testimony, engineers raised alarms repeatedly. They warned that certain components were not properly hardened, that machining shortcuts left debris risks inside oil passages, and that design changes made to reduce production time compromised long-term reliability. One particularly troubling claim alleges that oil passages were narrowed to speed manufacturing, a move that saved money but reduced lubrication tolerance under load. The whistleblower says these concerns were documented, discussed, and escalated, but instead of halting production or redesigning critical parts, leadership approved the engine anyway. The reason, according to internal conversations described by the former employee, was brutally simple. Fixing the problems would delay launch timelines and inflate costs. Shipping the engine as is protected quarterly targets. In private, engineers allegedly joked about the design being a time bomb. In public, GM marketed the engine as one of the most reliable V8 lineups the company had ever produced. If these claims are accurate, the issue wasn't incompetence. It was calculation. The engine wasn't rushed because GM didn't know better. It was rushed because leadership believed failures could be managed later, after vehicles were sold, warranties expired, and responsibility shifted. And once these engines left the lab and entered driveways across North America, the failures began telling a story GM could no longer control. The first public cracks in GM's story didn't come from executives, regulators, or lawsuits. They came from mechanics, the people who see failure up close, day after day, with no incentive to protect corporate narratives. Across North America, technicians began noticing something deeply unsettling. Engines weren't failing after years of hard use. They weren't breaking down under extreme towing or neglect. Many were dying early, sometimes within just a few thousand miles, and they were failing in nearly identical ways. Collapsed lifters, destroyed camshafts, severe oil starvation symptoms. Over and over again, the same damage patterns appeared, regardless of how carefully the vehicle had been maintained. At first, these cases were treated as isolated incidents, a bad batch, a fluke. But as months passed, repair bays began comparing notes. Independent shops spoke with dealership technicians. Online forums filled with eerily similar stories from owners who had never met, driven in different states, under different conditions, yet experienced the same catastrophic breakdowns. What troubled mechanics most wasn't just the frequency, it was the uniformity. Random failures don't look the same every time. Manufacturing shortcuts do. Technicians started referring to the issue quietly as a silent epidemic. Some joked darkly that the engines seemed designed to destroy themselves. Others weren't joking at all. Dealership insiders noticed that internal service bulletins used vague, sanitized language, phrases like lubrication irregularities or premature wear patterns, without ever addressing root causes. To seasoned mechanics, those phrases sounded less like diagnoses and more like legal shields. Then came the moment that confirmed their worst suspicions. Documents allegedly leaked from inside GM reached some of these technicians. The internal warnings mirrored exactly what mechanics had been seeing in the real world. The failures were not random, they were predictable, and they aligned perfectly with the design shortcuts engineers had reportedly flagged years earlier. The Whisper network didn't just expose a defect, it exposed a gap between what GM knew internally and what it was willing to admit publicly. And once that gap became visible, the pressure inside the company began to rise fast. As real-world failures mounted and internal documents began circulating, GM's engineering departments reportedly entered a state of quiet crisis. According to whistleblower accounts and leaked communications referenced in legal filings, the company was no longer debating whether a problem existed, it was debating how much damage control would cost. Internal emails showed engineers revisiting data that had been flagged years earlier. Reports detailed overheating lifters, unstable oil pressure under normal loads, and machining debris discovered in oil passages during teardown inspections. One internal assessment allegedly described the engine platform as a long-term durability risk that could escalate into widespread customer impact. Another internal warning focused on GM's fuel-saving hardware, a system designed to deactivate cylinders under light loads. On paper, it improved efficiency. In practice, it placed enormous stress on already vulnerable components and depended on flawless oil pressure to function safely. Engineers warned that even minor deviations could trigger catastrophic collapse. Yet despite the mounting evidence, recommendations to halt production or issue a redesign were consistently shut down. Leadership reportedly worried about missed launch windows, sunk tooling costs, and marketing commitments already made to dealers and consumers. Fixing the problem now would be expensive, letting it play out later seemed cheaper. According to insiders, there was an unspoken assumption in driving decisions. Many failures would occur after warranty periods ended. That calculation transformed a technical risk into a financial one, and the financial model won. Privately, engineers referred to the platform as unstable. Some allegedly called it a time bomb. Publicly, GM continued to advertise reliability, power, and long-term durability. When consumer complaints began accelerating and lawsuits loomed, GM reportedly scrambled to contain the narrative. Documentation was revised, language softened, scope minimized. The crisis wasn't framed as an engineering failure, but as scattered incidents caused by usage, maintenance, or external factors. The meltdown inside GM wasn't caused by a lack of data, it was caused by a refusal to act on it. And instead of confronting the defect head-on, GM chose a different path, one that would shift responsibility away from the company and onto its customers. When GM finally moved to address the growing number of engine failures, it did not announce a recall. It did not redesign critical components. Instead, it introduced what many critics now describe as a calculated distraction, a fix designed not to solve the problem, but to delay it. Dealerships were instructed to switch affected vehicles to thicker oil than originally specified. The change was presented as a routine adjustment, even framed as an improvement that would enhance durability. Owner manuals were quietly updated, oil caps were replaced, service advisors were given carefully scripted explanations. What customers weren't told was the underlying purpose. According to internal notes referenced in lawsuits, the thicker oil slowed the symptoms of failure, it reduced noise, it dampened early warning signs, and most importantly, it delayed catastrophic breakdowns just long enough to push many vehicles beyond warranty coverage. The consequences for drivers were immediate. Fuel economy declined, engines felt heavier and less responsive. Owners who purchased trucks for efficiency and performance saw operating costs rise without explanation. But from GM's perspective, the strategy worked. Warranty claims slowed, failure timelines stretched. Behind the scenes, executives reportedly celebrated reduced warranty exposure. The fix wasn't engineering-driven, it was financial. The cost of thicker oil was negligible compared to the cost of mass engine replacements. At the same time, dealerships were instructed to deflect blame. Customers with complete service histories were still told their failures stemmed from maintenance issues. Technicians were pressured to document alternative causes, no matter how implausible. Public relations teams worked to bury complaints and delay broader scrutiny. GM continued selling the same engines, unchanged, to new buyers, without disclosing known risks. By this point, the issue was no longer about a defective engine. It was about intent. A company that allegedly engineered a flawed product, concealed the evidence, blamed its customers, and deployed a fix designed to shift financial responsibility. And when engines continued to fail anyway, GM activated its final line of defense, a warranty system built not to protect drivers, but to protect the balance sheet. By the time engines began failing beyond the reach of GM's oil fix, many owners assumed the company's warranty would protect them. On paper, GM's coverage looked solid, 5 years or 60,000 miles, a promise of peace of mind meant to reinforce trust. In reality, that warranty became one of the most controversial elements of the entire scandal. Owners arriving at dealerships with catastrophic engine damage were met with an unexpected obstacle course. Service departments demanded complete maintenance histories with absolute precision. A single missing receipt, a misdated oil change, or service performed at an independent shop rather than a certified dealer could trigger an automatic denial. These technicalities often had no connection to the actual failure, yet they became decisive factors. Customers were stunned. Many had meticulously maintained their vehicles, believing GM's reputation alone would shield them from disaster. Instead, they were told their claims were invalid due to clerical gaps or procedural issues unrelated to lifter collapse or oil starvation. Repairs routinely exceeded tens of thousands of dollars, leaving families facing financial shock for vehicles they believed were protected. Small business owners were hit especially hard. Contractors, landscapers, and delivery operators relied on GM trucks for daily income. When engines failed and warranties were denied, vehicles sat immobilized while owners scrambled for loans, rentals, or replacements. Lost work compounded the damage. What should have been a safety net became a financial trap. Inside dealerships, a different story circulated quietly. Technicians spoke of internal pressure to minimize warranty approvals. Some claimed they could predict which claims would be denied before inspections even began. The process felt automated, scripted, and designed to discourage persistence. What emerged was a system that appeared calibrated not to investigate root causes, but to reduce payouts. The warranty, once marketed as protection, functioned instead as a barrier, shielding GM from financial exposure while transferring risk to consumers. But frustration didn't fade into resignation. Owners began comparing denial letters. Patterns emerged, and soon those patterns found their way into courtrooms across the country. What began as scattered complaints quickly transformed into a coordinated legal assault. Attorneys representing individual owners began recognizing familiar details across cases: identical failures, identical denial language, identical explanations from GM. The coincidence was too consistent to ignore. Class action lawsuits soon formed in multiple states, consolidating thousands of claims under a single accusation that GM knowingly sold vehicles with defective engines and systematically concealed the risks. Discovery requests forced the company to release internal emails, engineering reports, and development timelines. What those documents allegedly revealed stunned even seasoned legal experts. According to filings, GM had been aware of serious engine vulnerabilities long before acknowledging any widespread issue publicly. Internal communications discussed financial exposure, recall avoidance strategies, and the risk of reputational damage if defects were disclosed too broadly. Engineers' warnings appeared alongside executive decisions prioritizing cost containment and production schedules. Federal agencies opened inquiries into whether GM violated consumer protection laws or failed to disclose known defects. Some investigators questioned whether the scale of concealment crossed into criminal territory, though no charges were immediately filed. The scrutiny alone marked a turning point. GM could no longer manage the narrative behind closed doors. For owners, the lawsuits delivered validation. Failures they were told were isolated now appeared systemic. Experiences dismissed as misuse now looked like consequences of design decisions. Plaintiffs who once felt alone suddenly became part of a nationwide movement. The legal avalanche exposed not just a defective engine, but a corporate strategy, one that treated engineering risk as a manageable liability rather than a responsibility to customers. And as courtrooms filled, GM faced a reality it could no longer escape. Then came the announcement the company hoped would close the chapter: When General Motors announced an $888 million settlement, the company framed it as a responsible step forward, a commitment to resolution and accountability. But inside the auto industry and financial markets, few believed the story ended there. Legal analysts quickly pointed out that the settlement covered only a portion of affected vehicles. Thousands of owners were excluded based on production dates or technical criteria. Additional lawsuits remained active. Regulatory inquiries were still unfolding. Estimates soon emerged suggesting GM's total exposure could exceed $2 billion once all costs were tallied. The market reacted immediately. GM's stock dipped as investors reassessed long-term risk. Consumer confidence took a sharper hit. Reliability rankings dropped, with watchdog groups placing GM's V8 platforms among the least dependable engines of their era. Dealerships reported buyers walking away from purchases, not just of affected models, but of GM vehicles entirely. Inside the company, executives attempted to project stability. Public statements emphasized lessons learned and forward momentum. Yet internal leaks suggested deep concern that the damage to GM's reputation might be permanent. Trust, once broken, rarely returns on command. Competitors sensed opportunity. Without naming GM directly, rival automakers leaned into messaging centered on durability, transparency, and engineering discipline. Fleet buyers, once loyal to GM, began shifting contracts elsewhere. Even long-time customers hesitated. The settlement, enormous by any measure, failed to restore confidence. Instead, it confirmed what critics feared, that GM was responding under pressure rather than leading with transparency. And while GM tried to repair its image, the industry around it moved fast, circling, capitalizing, and preparing to take ground. GM might never recover. The most consequential fallout from GM's engine crisis did not come from courtrooms, regulators, or competitors. It came from ordinary consumers and the way they fundamentally changed how they buy vehicles. For decades, most buyers trusted that major automakers would act in good faith. Defects might happen, but companies would fix them. Warranties would protect owners. Problems would be disclosed before they became widespread. That assumption collapsed almost overnight. As details of GM's alleged decisions spread, online communities transformed into investigative hubs. Mechanics shared teardown photos. Owners posted timelines of failures. Independent reviewers compared service bulletins, warranty denials, and settlement exclusions. What once required insider access now unfolded publicly, in real time. Buyers began researching vehicles differently. Reliability scores alone were no longer enough. Consumers examined recall histories, lawsuit records, and how companies handled past failures. They scrutinized service language, looked for patterns of denial, and questioned whether efficiency claims came at the expense of durability. Brand loyalty, once passed down through generations, weakened rapidly. GM felt this shift immediately. Longtime customers openly questioned whether the company deserved another chance. Parents who had driven Chevrolet trucks their entire lives advised their children to look elsewhere. Fleet operators rewrote procurement rules to prioritize transparency and failure response history over purchase price alone. This awakening reshaped the industry. Automakers realized defects could no longer be managed quietly. Delays, deflections, and corporate language now carried reputational costs far greater than recalls themselves. Trust became a measurable asset, and its absence a liability. GM's crisis became a case study taught informally across the auto world, not just how engines fail, but how credibility collapses. The lesson was unmistakable. In an era of radical transparency, concealment accelerates downfall. And while competitors adjusted and consumers adapted, GM was left facing a far more difficult challenge, rebuilding belief in a brand many felt had betrayed them. General Motors now stands at a crossroads few corporations ever fully recover from. The controversy surrounding its V8 engines exposed more than a technical failure. It revealed a deeper cultural problem, one where financial timelines allegedly overruled engineering judgment, and where damage control replaced accountability. The lawsuits, settlements, and regulatory scrutiny were severe, but they were only symptoms. The real wound was trust. Once customers began to believe that problems were not just overlooked, but knowingly allowed, the foundation of GM's reputation fractured. Rebuilding will require more than redesigned components or extended warranties. It will demand transparency at a level the company has rarely shown before. Engineers must be empowered, not overridden. Problems must be disclosed early, not minimized. Customers must be treated as partners, not liabilities. Even then, the road ahead remains uncertain. The market GM now faces is harsher, more informed, and less forgiving. Rivals are stronger. Consumers are skeptical. Regulators are watchful. Every future decision will be measured against this moment. GM's survival will not be decided by press releases, court rulings, or marketing campaigns. It will be decided in driveways, repair shops, and buying decisions made by millions of people who are no longer willing to accept assurances without proof. Whether GM becomes a story of collapse or redemption depends on what comes next, and whether the company understands that trust, once broken, is not reclaimed by silence. This story isn't over, and the next chapter may define not just GM's future, but the future of how automakers are held accountable in an industry that can no longer afford secrecy. The question now isn't what GM says, it's whether anyone is still willing to believe it. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.